On today's show, we are on the doorstep of Media Day. It's coming up on Monday. In the meantime, we'll have the latest news around the Atlanta Hawks and a visit from Greg Wissinger. Talk about the Kings pick, because that's still a big factor for the Hawks coming up this season. We'll get into all of that and more on the show.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1807 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you on a Friday evening here in late September. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. Begin the football season right now with a big return at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I also want to tell you at the top of the podcast, as I always do on the pod, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Check us out and subscribe to the podcast anywhere you find your podcasts. That includes Apple and Spotify, as well as places like Amazon Music and Overcast. We're also on the video side over on YouTube. Please like this video as you are watching it and subscribe on that platform. It's been a busy week for us on the show. This is our 5th episode of the week. The first 4 were varying in nature. The first one on Monday was a mailbag episode with me answering your questions. On Tuesday and Wednesday, we did a 2-part deep dive into Trae Young with my friend Glenn Willis of ATL and 29. We've had lots of talk with Glenn over the last several months about the entire roster. Those are all relevant episodes at this point in time. And then on Thursday, I did the start of our annual Over-Under series with Robbie Calland of Dime that dropped in the feed yesterday, talking about the Northwest Division. We'll have more of that coming up as well. So we're running the gamut right now, ramping up. And unless something crazy happens over the weekend, this is going to be the last show that I do before the season, quote-unquote, begins on Monday with Media Day. I will be in the building for the Hawks Media Day beginning on Monday morning into Monday afternoon. It's kind of an all-day affair at this time of year. And we'll have full coverage of that, post probably with some extended audio off your audio subscribers from Quinn and Landry, plus my own reactions, some sort of spurts in audio, all that stuff. We'll have full takeaways from that event on Monday evening. In the meantime, there's a little bit of news. The Hawks officially signed Jordan Bowden and Jordan Nicholas to camp deals this week, and then they were actually waived within the next 24 hours. That is procedural. I've been talking about this for a while, last couple of weeks with Joey Hauser, et cetera. The Hawks tend to bring in a lot of different guys on Exhibit 10 contracts, and they waive them. At least most of them had them go to G League. Right now, they actually have 2 guys who are still on the roster at this point in time, albeit on those non-guaranteed contracts. One of them is Kevon Harris. The other one is Daquan Plowden, who the Hawks signed to an Exhibit 10 deal today on Friday. He was on a 2-way recently with the Warriors before he was cut by them. A pretty interesting player, actually. I think Harris and Plowden are probably really high-end Exhibit 10 contract guys. Again, the best guess at this point in time, as I've been saying the entire time, is that those guys will be cut later on in camp and sent to the G League. But there's a chance that the Hawks do something else to create a roster spot. They do have a full roster at this point in time, but still bring guys in who have actual potential in the NBA. To have them in College Park or whatever is usually good process. With that said, that's kind of the only news of the day. Before I bring in my guest, Greg Wissinger of Kings Herald, I want to sort of tell you what we'll be talking about on the podcast today, remind everybody of the logistics around the protected Sacramento Kings draft pick that the Hawks possess. This podcast will be, from now on, a focus on the Kings this year. If you missed it, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I talked to Anthony Irwin of Lakers fame about the Lakers and the same concept. The Hawks have the Lakers pick unprotected. So no matter what happens, once the Hawks trade that pick, the Lakers will directly impact the Hawks this year. Last year, I spent a lot of time talking about this all year long when the pick from the Kings could have conveyed if they made the playoffs. Longtime listeners will know and fans will know that this is the pick that came in the Kevin Huerter transaction. And last year, it was a pretty good chance going into like April that it was going to come to Atlanta last year. The Kings won the first play-in game, then lost to the Pelicans in the second play game, and then missed the playoffs. And because they missed the playoffs, they kept that pick. It became the 13th pick in the draft. It became Devin Carter, and the pick rolled over. If the Kings had made the playoffs last year, the Hawks would have got their pick. It was that close. This time around, the protection is a little bit different. It's only top 12 protected in 2025. That means if the Kings pick in the top 12, they keep the pick. If the pick falls between 13 and 30, it goes to the Hawks. And then if the Kings keep it this year, i.e. if they are in the top 12, it will roll over again to next year, become top 10 protected in 2026. And then if it does not convey again, at that point, it becomes 2 unprotected second-round picks, 1 in 26 and 1 in 27. So long story short, we'll focus on this year when talking to Greg in a second about what the Kings are going to be. That's the whole picture, and that's why I'm doing the podcast. It's a good time to kind of check in on the Lakers, on the Kings. Obviously, the Hawks are priority one in this space, and this time around, as we'll talk about even with Greg in a second, the Lakers are sexier. It's unprotected. The upside is a lot higher, so that's more intriguing to me and fans and the team and all that. But that Kings pick is a real asset, for lack of a better term. That pick will matter. And I think if you had to guess, we'll get into this later on in the show about whether it's going to come or not. It's very reasonable to project the Hawks getting this pick this year. It's not guaranteed by any means, but we'll talk about that in a second with Greg. So without any further delay, one more time as a reminder to subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends. We'll tell you that again at the end of the podcast today, but we'll stop right now and dive in with myself and Greg Wissinger on the Kings. I'm joined by a repeat guest to talk about the same thing we talked about a year ago, and that is Greg Wissinger. Hello, sir. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
I'm well. Before I brought you in, I gave people the nuts and bolts on this thing, why we're talking essentially. Why would a Hawks podcast do a Kings discussion in September? I think Hawks fans know for the most part, but it is what it is. It's interesting because I feel like, I made fun of this a second ago, but it does feel like we're doing the same thing again because it's like similar expectations for the Kings last year and this year, I would say somewhat similar. Of course, I'll ask you what you think because you're the expert on the King. It's why you're here. But yeah, it's kind of like, all right, the Kings are kind of projected right sort of in the range where the pick could convey or not convey. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation. It's kind of an upstaged. Obviously, it doesn't matter to you, but Hawks fans are way more focused on the Lakers pick this time around for obvious reasons. It's unprotected. It's new. It's shiny. But how are you feeling about the Kings right now in September before the season starts?
I mean, it's September, so everything's going to be great. We're going to win every team's going to win the championship, right? Like all the offseason moves are going to work. I'm feeling pretty good overall. I mean, the Kings nailed a couple of big things that I think that they had to do this summer. Kept Malik Monk, made some sort of roster change to kind of shake things up, and with moving off of Harrison Barnes, bringing in DeMar DeRozan. So I think that there's reason for optimism, but the West is loaded, so I think it's still going to be a tricky path going forward. But hopefully we can convey that pick to you guys.
That's interesting too. Like when I talked to Anthony Irwin, obviously the Lakers, that pick's coming no matter what, but they want that pick to be as humanly possible. So they're rooting for it's different motivations. And this time it's kind of like the Hawks and Kings are kind of aligned. The Hawks want this pick. The Kings would rather it be the 28th pick than the 15th pick, of course, but they still want the pick to convey, which is interesting. You mentioned the West. I kind of want to start there because the Kings won 46 games last year. That was only tied for 9th in the West. Interesting, because the year before they won 48 games, which is only 2 more, and they were 3rd in the West. So it was like this really interesting situation where like the pack in the West was like at 49-50 last year, whereas the pack was like 43. And I don't really know where that aligns. I think the consensus is, and I guess I'll ask you, where would 46 wins put you this year, you think, in the West? Would it be somewhere in that play-in range again, or would that be enough to get you in that 5-6 seed range? I don't know. We're all guessing, of course, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to be similar, but maybe just a little bit higher. I think that there's a couple of teams that kind of realistically have gotten worse this summer in the West. I mean, you look at the Clippers losing Paul George, and now Kawhi's had more offseason knee stuff that we just heard about right before we started recording. So, I mean, they did add some pieces to kind of try to piecemeal make up for the loss of them, but that's obviously a big impact. The Warriors losing Clay, and they obviously added pieces, and you can kind of debate how much losing Clay helps or hurts at this point, but they've got some things up in the air. The Pelicans are kind of in a weird spot where they're making changes and don't really have a center other than Daniel Tice. So there's a couple of teams that have some big question marks, but at the same time, like the Rockets would probably be a little bit better this year. Expect the Grizzlies to be better than they were last year. So the West is going to stay tough, but I think that there is reason to think that maybe it might not be quite as tough as it was last year, at least in the middle of the pack. I think the top of the West will still be pretty strong, but I do think that there may be a little bit less of a logjam right in the middle this year.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Football is here in a big way. If you're an NFL fan, start the season right with a big return at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. If you happen to have a hunch in the middle of a game, check out a ton of different information sets from a live stats and play-by-play to the latest overarching stuff and much more on the same page when you are placing your bets at FanDuel Sportsbook. You also get started with a great offer from FanDuel, and that is $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel. You should also know the FanDuel Sportsbook app is really easy to use as well. They have everything that you're looking for in the sports betting space, from over-unders to point spreads to live betting. They have money lines and player props, same-game parlays, future bets, and much more. The app is safe and secure at FanDuel. They cover the entire range of sports as well. That includes the NBA, as you might expect. Listen to this podcast. WNBA is there, NFL, college football, baseball, hockey, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and so much more. And now is an awesome time to sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. And the place to go is FanDuel.com to get started and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. One more time, visit FanDuel.com and check out America's #1 sportsbook. So I'll ask you this. It's more of a future-facing conversation that we're going to have. It's more about what's going to happen. But what happened last year? Because it's not like the bottom fell out of the Kings. They won 2 fewer games, but they went from #1 in the league in offense the year before to being pretty good, but not excellent by any means the next year offensively. They got better defensively. Obviously, the vibes change when you go from being the 3 seed to the 9 seed, even if the team quality was kind of similar in some respects. But what did you make of last year? Obviously, they made some changes too that we're going to talk about in a second. But did that feel like a season that was appropriate? 46 wins, 9 seed. Was that what the Kings felt like last year? Was that unlucky? Was it lucky? What do you think about where the baseline was?
It felt unlucky, but it also felt in line with how the season had gone. It felt like just a lot of things weren't quite bouncing right last year in the way that they had the year before. We saw a couple of guys kind of have some regression on their shooting, among them Kevin Huerter. He had kind of a rough year. The injuries down the stretch to both Huerter and Monk, I think, really hurt them. But some of it also was just kind of a shift in focus. There was a lot of emphasis on the defense last year, and it didn't start off great, but by the end of the year, the Kings actually had a pretty solid, pretty respectable defense. But it seemed to have come at the expense of the offensive firepower. And how much of that was just those minor tweaks? How much of that was personnel? How much was just a shot here and there missing that would have swung momentum? I think a little bit of it was just that the West recovered, because the year before had been a very weird year where 48 wins got you the 3 seed. We knew it at the time. That is not normal for the Western standings.
Not in the West.
So, we expected the West to be harder, and a lot of us, myself included, last year predicted that the Kings' win total would be similar, but their seed would be lower. So it kind of went according to expectation, but at the same time, it still felt like there was more potential than what they did last year. So it did feel a little bit like growing pains. It felt like a little bit of bad luck. A little bit, I think teams were more ready for them. I mean, especially early in the season, you're not catching anyone by surprise. You have to adjust because teams now know that they just got to attack your dribble handoff with Sabonis. So there's a lot of growing pains that went into it, but I think that there's still plenty of reason for optimism moving forward as they continue to grow. And as much as last year was probably really frustrating both for fans and the team itself, I think it is something that is a good lesson and you can kind of move forward from.
Yeah, I can see, of course, I don't cover the team every day, but I can see a little bit of a dream situation for the Kings where it's hey, if we could just marry this defensive improvement with our offense from the year before, you start to think pretty big, of course. And that didn't, of course, happen. And I guess it's a good time to kind of bring up the changes they made. The big splash is DeMar DeRozan, big name, multi-time All-Star guy. Harrison Barnes out the door. There were many times where you and I discussed offline and think, Hawks and Harrison Barnes. Ultimately, he got traded, not to the Hawks after all those things, the John Collins cycle, all that. But Barnes and Davion Mitchell are not there anymore. Chris Duarte. The big thing is DeMar. So what do you make of the addition? Do you like it, number one? And how does that change the projection from it was not the same team for 2 years, but similar personnel for 2 years. And this is a pretty big change, both stylistically maybe, and also just a guy who everybody's knows and understands is going to be their third best player, at least on paper at this point.
Yeah, I was a big fan of the move. I think that while there's obviously some question marks on kind of the fit and the defense, and DeMar DeRozan's older at this point, but when you look at how productive DeRozan is, especially compared to Harrison Barnes, and I'm not just trying to bash on Harrison Barnes, but DeMar DeRozan is a substantially better player, and what he brings to the table, the price tag, like the opportunity cost, like I love the move overall. I was a little disappointed it was their only thing. Like when they still had some pieces after that trade, I was kind of thinking like maybe they'll do something else this summer as well. But realistically, that might be getting a little greedy. Like retain Malik Monk, you bring in DeRozan. Like those are two pretty substantial moves for the summer. I do think that DeRozan really brings a lot of offensive versatility to address some of the areas where we saw them struggle at times last year, where they would get stuck where no one could create unless it was Fox or Monk. They just lacked, creation off the dribble, and obviously DeRozan still brings that. He also brings another release valve or a creator in the fourth quarter. Same thing last year. There was a lot of stand around and hope Fox could create something, stand around, wait for Monk to do something. So having another option who is really good in clutch situations, again, when you're looking at 2 wins being that big a difference, because I mean, 48 wins, if they had the same win total as last year, they'd have been a couple notches higher, different seeding in the play-in. Like it all could have shaken out differently. So I think that having what DeRozan brings addresses a lot of the issues we saw last year. And they didn't give up a lot because Barnes was primarily just kind of spotting up in the corner. He wasn't creating off the dribble a lot. Like he would occasionally have a good game that reminded you like, oh, that's Harrison Barnes. Like he's still capable of doing it. But most nights he wasn't doing a ton. And for all the concerns about DeRozan's defense, I watched Harrison Barnes play a lot of bad defense over the last couple of years too. So I don't think that that's that big of a difference one way or the other.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because in DeMar, it's interesting. Like there's one side that's like he's a terrible defender, which I don't really buy. I don't think he's good defensively, but he does have positional size. Like he's pretty athletic still. He knows how to play. He's not a good defender, but like he doesn't kill you. And offensively, it's interesting that you point out like he definitely fills that, shot creation that every team needs at some point. Like my initial reaction was kind of like, do they really need DeMar DeRozan's skill set? And I think when like the beautiful game Kings are going, they don't need that. But you're right to note that like nobody plays that way all the time. Even the number 1 overall offense Kings from 2 years ago, at some point they're going to block down, and you're going to need somebody besides Fox to create a shot. Because Sabonis, for as good as he is not like a individual shot creator a ton. Like he can do a little bit of that, but like it's interesting to me. I can't believe I've been thinking about it for months now. I don't know how I feel about the DeMar DeRozan move. I think it's fine for what they paid. I don't think it's bad. I just don't know if it's going to work. I don't know. I mean, that's.
I think that's fair.
Is that fair? Okay. I don't want to be unfair to my guest on the podcast who's covering the Kings, but it's like I'm more of a question mark, and not. I don't mean that in a negative way. I need to see it. I think just to like figure out how it's actually going to happen. It's a weird one to me.
I think it's completely fair to question it. Like I'm optimistic about it because it's our shiny new toy, right? Like it's our new addition.
I don't blame you.
Yeah. And I see all the ways that it could be positive. I'm fully aware of the ways it could not work and could be an awkward fit and all that. But I don't know. I think it's a good move, and I am not extremely worried, but I do think it's perfectly fair. And I don't really take issue with anyone who says like, I kind of need to see this work before I buy in. So.
Yeah, and we could do a whole breakdown of like the second guard starting spot because Malik Monk is back, and if this was a Kings preview that was an hour long, I might dive into that more. I will also mention you mentioned Kevin Huerter had kind of a bad year last year. I'll always have affection for Kevin. I enjoyed covering Kevin. I think he'll be better than he was last year, just as a baseline.
So.
There's no reason he wouldn't be better. Like, he's going to be 26. It's not like he's a 35-year-old who's falling off. And he's always been able to shoot for all of the shortcomings. He just kind of couldn't shoot for a while last year, which was strange. You watched him closer than I did. Does that sound about right? I feel like he just like lost his confidence maybe a little bit as a shooter.
Yeah, it felt like the issue was just between the ears, confidence, not in the flow, whatever it was. And even before he got hurt, he was on a real short leash the second half of the season. I mean, Mike Brown was still starting him. He didn't take away that starting spot, but he was getting pulled out of games pretty quickly a lot of the time. Really hoping for a bounce back here. I don't think he'll be a starter, at least at the beginning of the year. I do think it'll be
Yeah.
Keon Ellis still, but really hoping that maybe with a little less pressure coming off the bench, he can come in and just kind of thrive and kind of feast on some second unit defenders and regain some confidence and realistically regain some trade value because right now it doesn't seem like his future is in Sacramento, and it'd be fantastic if he could build up his value to where he lands in a good spot for him and something that still benefits for the Kings.
Yeah, I mean, for Kings seem to be really high. Keon Ellis, they got Malik
Mhm.
Monk, who they got on a deal that made total sense for him, for the team. I mean, he got
Yeah.
paid, of course, but and then you got I just blanked on the name. Why is it not? Oh, and then they got Devin Carter, who's hurt right now, but who they obviously liked enough to draft in the lottery. So
Yeah.
I just want to at least ask about Kevin. It's the one personnel crossover between the two teams.
Right.
Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. You can win up to 100 times the money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. And PrizePicks is also the best way to get on the action in sports in most states, including California, Texas, and Georgia. PrizePicks put their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. And when your picks hit, you get the money as fast as 15 minutes later. PrizePicks is also invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup is not perfect. Double the money. You can even do that and double the money if one of your picks does not hit. You can spend your football weekends at PrizePicks and know that basketball is coming soon as well. So a great time to sign up right now and go ahead and join the PrizePicks community. Download the PrizePicks app right now today and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA when you get there. From there, you will get $50 instantly when you play $5. That code is LOCKEDONNBA at PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. Let's talk about what the floor is, what the ceiling is, what people might think. Because I feel like this is a pretty high floor team. And when I say that, they could still be in the play-in. They could be, floor. Maybe they could look. And the West is really good. Actually, I'll throw the data out at you now. So we have partners at FanDuel Sportsbook on this podcast. The Kings over-under right now is 46.5 wins, which is about what they were last year. It's essentially what they won 46 last year. That puts them 7th in the West. That puts them in the play-in, but as the home court advantage team in the play-in, advantage them. But they're also right in the same range with the Pelicans. They're narrowly ahead of the Warriors and the Rockets and the Lakers. That's 11 teams for 8 spots that I just named, and they're all pretty close together. Before you even get to the Clippers, or maybe Wemby goes absolutely nuclear and the Spurs win 37 games. I don't know. So I'm not trying to pour cold water. Is there a chance the Kings don't even make the play-in? Is that a possible outcome? That's not even, and I'm not saying the injuries, because every team has injury downside.
Yeah.
Reasonable injury luck. Could they be the 11th team in the West? Is that possible?
Possible, but I'd be very surprised. I do think that their floor is realistically to be in the play-in, somewhere in that mix.
Yeah, 7 to 10 range. Yeah, that's kind of, it's weird. I feel like it's not sexy because I have argued and will argue the Lakers' downside is quite low. So this is a Hawks podcast.
Yeah.
That matters more because the pick has actual upside. This pick is protected. So the upside for the Hawks is very limited. The Hawks are going to be candidly rooting for the Kings to be the 8th seed. That's what they want the Kings to be. Yeah. Whereas the Lakers, you want, not that you're rooting for injury, but you want lottery ball, you want ping pong balls and all that. I feel like the Kings are, safe's the wrong word, but you got stars that are not huge injury risks historically. You got an offense that makes sense and is going to be good. Even DeMar is really always has been really durable as a player. He's coming
very
over
durable player,
mid 30s guy. And I feel like I'll ask the other side now. What is the upside? Let's say everything goes perfectly in your mind. What is the realistic ceiling for the Kings?
Yeah, if everything goes well, if everything goes just best case scenario, I think the Kings could be a top 4 team in the West. I think that we would have to see a pretty unexpected additional leap forward from De'Aaron Fox for them to be much beyond that into that real title contender realm, but I do think that they could flirt with that top 4. But he's also had pretty significant improvements the last 2 years. So it's kind of, it all really falls on him because the other pieces around Fox are there now. So now it's kind of that ceiling is how high can he go? And he's getting kind of late in his career to take yet another step into that true, like, like an MVP level player. But that would really be what would raise the ceiling beyond just kind of that top 4 range, I think.
Yeah, and look, there's only a couple of teams that I would be like surprised if they didn't win more games than the Kings. Like I would pick the Kings to not be a top 4 team. I think
That's
you might
fair.
too.
Like,
it doesn't matter. It is what it is. But like the Thunder, I would be pretty surprised if they didn't win more games than the Kings. That's one.
Mm-hmm.
The Wolves, there's a couple teams, but like as good as the West is, it's a lot of teams that are like a half tier ahead of the Kings or like similar tier to the, it's not if things broke. So I try to be realistic with floor and ceiling outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I don't think the Kings are going to win 55 games, but like, could they win 52 games? Like, sure they could. I don't know why they couldn't.
Right.
So it's like, it's kind of a narrow range because I do think that realistically, maybe their floor is the 11th seed or something like that, 10, 11, and maybe their ceiling is like the 4 seed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe your range is higher than that. That's fine.
Sure.
But that's a relatively projectable range of compared to a lot of teams. Like there are some teams like, Boston's range is pretty thin at the very top, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of these teams, like in the West, it's kind of flexible. But I think for the Hawks, this is doing through the Hawks lens, if they just hit their projections, you get a decent pick out of this. And that's kind of, and again, you led with it. The Kings would be okay with that. If the Kings win 48 games this year, are you going to feel okay with that and convey the 20th pick in the draft? Like, it's not a bad outcome for you, I don't think.
Yeah. And to me, this is going to sound strange because obviously the wins are important and you want to have like a successful season and all that. But I think
Vibes.
Where that shakes out seeding.
Yeah, that's also fair.
Matters a lot more to me.
No, I should have done that too because that's bad by me because we talked already about how the range was so different 2 years ago. So yeah, you're right. I should say non-play-in. Like if they're not a play-in team, that's a success, I assume.
Yes.
For you.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd be very really the goal that I'm thinking about as a Kings fan, and I think a lot of Kings fans are in a similar place, is that what would really be considered a successful season this year is getting to the second round. Like you want to get past that first round hump. Like you want to be in the playoffs. You want to maybe advance around. Like that would be a really good season. And I don't think losing in the first round again would be a colossal failure by any means, because it all depends on matchups and all those different things. But I think like being in the playoffs, not missing the playoffs, whether it's playing or otherwise, like however you get there, be in the playoffs and hopefully advance to the second round. Like that's really kind of the goals that I think most Kings fans would agree on this year.
And that makes sense.
And if that means getting rid of the pick, like that's fantastic, because then that opens up more possibilities for them to do.
Then you could trade your own picks in the future. That's all things that if this was a Kings podcast, we'd be talking about. Like the limitations of having a protected pick are real about what you can do with your other picks because of Stepien rule and all those things. Just as one more number to throw at you from our friends at FanDuel. And look, the betting market is not all knowing. It is a pretty good projection usually, but the Kings are minus 190 to make the playoffs. So that's about 65%, 70% chance of making the playoffs. That's of course more often than not. And then when you throw in the chances, and this is where I know that you don't want this, Greg, as you were my guest on this podcast, this time around, it's top 12 protected. So if the Kings miss the playoffs as the 9 or 10 seed in the West, that is actually what the Hawks would want, because that way they're the 13th, 14th. So last year it was very clear, very easy to explain to people. Kings playoffs, yes, they all that stuff. This time around, there's that narrow band where the Kings could lose the play-in like they did last year. Like, okay, if you simulated the season again the same way as last year, this time around, the Hawks would have the 13th pick in the draft. Because that's where the Kings picked last year. They got to keep it. This year, 13 would come to Atlanta. So we'll see. I mean, I'm sure we'll be tracking this all the way to the end. Maybe for your sake, maybe the Kings will just cruise into the playoffs and we'll know on April 10th where this pick's going to be. That would be easier for a lot of us, I think. Or they'll have to sweat out the play-in. Because last year, I'm sure we corresponded during this. I was like, there was a literally a winner in play-in game that decided whether the Hawks were going to have a first round pick or not.
Yeah,
this happened.
Yeah.
So hopefully not that again for your sake.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Yeah. For your heart,
Yeah.
your soul, your vibes, all those things.
No, passing off the 13th pick despite freeing up everything else, like that would be a nightmare scenario.
It would be
Kings.
tough.
Like,
Yeah, that's what they don't want for sure.
Yeah.
And that is
Yeah.
the only quote unquote upside with the way they structured the trade when it happened.
Yeah.
I guess before we get out of here, do you have an official prediction? Like, I mean, you could give win total, you could give seeding, you could give what pick what pick the Hawks get. Any way you want to do it. Do you have a rough projection of what you actually think? Because look, we've talked about what it could be, ceilings, floors, etc. I need the Greg prediction, probably reckless prediction, because you're optimistic. It's September. You can shoot for the moon if you want to. I'm trying to tell the Hawks what to maybe fear or expect by the end of this thing.
Yeah. I have not given it a whole lot of thought at this point.
That's fine. It's early. It's way too early.
Yeah, if we're going September vibes and being a little fun and reckless, I'm going to go ahead and say 50 wins. Like, why not? Like, that's where we want to be.
50 wins. It's probably like 4 or 5 in the West, if I had to guess.
Yeah. And that'd be fantastic. I'd be thrilled with that season.
Yeah, of course you would.
And that'd be really good.
And that would be like the 22nd pick in the draft. It's not the best thing the Hawks would want, but it was not the worst outcome in the world.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not a bad place for everybody to be in what feels like a pretty good draft coming up. So yeah, okay. Hopefully that's a decent projection of what the Kings are going to be, what the Hawks will be tracking. Again, I understand that there'll be a lot less attention on the Kings this year than the Lakers. Last year it was just, all right, Hawks pick and Kings. Now the Hawks don't have their own pick, so it's going to be all Lakers all the time, especially if like the Lakers start to stumble out of the gate. You're going to see Cooper Flag Photoshops. It's going to be just absolute chaos on Twitter. But and I literally the other day, I will tell you this, we're on the podcast still, I will say I got an email the other day from someone who emails me all the time. It's a pretty dedicated Hawks fan. And they were like, do they still have the Kings pick? Like, they didn't even know. And this is someone who like knows things. Like, they're very plugged in. They're a fan, but they're not like, I was like, I guess I should probably do a show about the Kings because people have kind of forgotten the Kings pick exists. So yes, the Hawks have this pick. It's protected. It may or may not come. And I think what I will say, I won't give my projection, but I believe the pick is considerably more likely than not to convey, especially when you factor in that sliver that you don't want, Greg, that 9-10 range that would still go to the Hawks. That puts it to like, 2/3 of the time, at least for me, the pick will convey to Atlanta, which is all the Hawks care about at this point.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, really, if it doesn't convey this year, something disastrous happened, like major injuries or kind of something like what we saw with Memphis last year. It'd have to be that type of season, I think, before.
Yeah, they have to be basically the 11. Yeah. I mean, because given the fact that the East is the East and the West is the West, you would project the 9 and 10 teams in the West to be 13 and 14.
Yeah.
So basically, given that projection, and that's not a guarantee, but that's logically that's what it's probably going to be. That means the Kings have to finish 11th or worst in the West for the pick to not come to Atlanta. Mm-hmm. So I think based on what they've done, again, I'm knocking on wood for your sake and everybody's. I don't want everybody to get hurt ever, but like they have pretty durable stars, a competent coach. Mike Brown's good at his job. Like they don't have a ton of like super downside risk that I see. So, and it's pretty deep roster too. Like I know we talked mostly about, because it's not a Kings podcast, so I'm not going to go into like the rotation stuff, but like they have a bunch of competent players on this team. Malik Monk that was a heist for the Kings side. I'm sure you were thrilled that he signed that contract.
Oh my gosh, yes, that was amazing.
So yeah, I kind of like the Kings. I enjoy watching the Kings. I hope Devin Carter plays basketball soon because I really, really liked him as a prospect. I know he's been out for a long time, I know, but I still like that just for your sake. I like Devin Carter. So all right, Greg. Well, thanks for being here. Please plug. I will try to get Hawks fans to pay attention to the Kings, and I will do that through you. So what do you have going on in Kings coverage that people could be following?
Well, real quick before I jump into that, I just wanted to let you also know that Kings fans universally are going to be rooting for the Hawks to get the first overall pick with the Lakers pick. Like that would be just a dream scenario for all of us. So
for the entire league, everybody other than Lakers fans will be rooting for that scenario. I think just like for the shenanigans.
The league would probably come in and like retroactively veto that trade to give the Lakers back the pick or something. But we'll all be rooting for it.
Can you imagine Twitter on the night of the lottery if the Lakers pick that they owe becomes Cooper Flag? Like
that'd be
just
amazing.
The shenanigans of that would be incredible to anybody. I mean, it would be to the Hawks by then because I'd be shocked if the Hawks trade that pick. But Ooh, will be fun.
But yeah, so you can find me. I'm on Twitter at GWiz, talk about Kings there, and then I'm the managing editor for KingsHerald.com. We're independent Sacramento Kings coverage. So game previews, recaps, commentary, breaking news, anything like that. You can find it all there. Just KingsHerald.com.
And I will say this genuinely, when I do stuff for Dime or when I'm writing for Sportsline in the past or whatever, and I need to check on a Kings thing, I will go read Kings Herald. So that should be a recommendation from me to listeners. Like, check out the Kings. It's you're not rooting for the Kings necessarily, but like you're not rooting against the Kings either. So it's I would just
you want us to do reasonably well.
I enjoy Kings fans that I know in my life. Kings Herald's a fun website. People should be reading it and following Greg on Twitter. Look, if this gets tight again later in the season, maybe we'll talk about it. And maybe by the end of this, you'll have that sweet release of not having to do this podcast ever again if you convey this draft pick. So
happy to come on anytime.
Thanks, Greg, for being here. As for everybody else, please subscribe to this podcast anywhere you find podcasts, Spotify, Apple, etc. Please like the show on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube, follow everybody, follow Greg, and we'll see you all next time.